A recent subject of discussion of teaching was about the clarity of one's aim and also about having the wisdom to take actions that bring you in the direction of your aim instead of opposite your aim. In regard to the Buddha's teachings and the practice of the Buddha's teachings, it's hard to put enough emphasis on the importance of what your aim is. There's no use and no point in trying to practice the Buddha's teachings and follow the Buddha's teachings if our aim does not lie on the path to go out of suffering. Everything starts here. There are two paths that we can decide to take, two main paths, and everything that we can do falls into one of these. One is the way to cause suffering, and one is the way to go out of sufferings. And normally we get all of these mixed up, and we think that we are trying to lessen our sufferings when actually we're creating our sufferings. So we have to understand, first of all, the difference between how to cause sufferings and how to remove sufferings. If the aim is really to end suffering, to go along that path, then this is what the Buddha teaches. So when our aim is perfectly clear, then it makes everything very simple. All that we do is in the service of our aim, to end sufferings. But the problem is, where the confusion and the difficulty always comes in, is that first of all, we misunderstand. We have misunderstandings about how to go about removing sufferings, how to go about ending sufferings. And we think that we're doing something good when in fact we're doing something wrong. Secondly, we like those things that actually keep us in suffering. Ajahn often gives the analogy of somebody who is diabetic, that because he eats too much sugar, he develops diabetes, and now he has a lot of physical problems, a lot of suffering on account of being diabetic. How to end his sufferings is quite simple. You have to stop eating sugar. You have to stop eating carbohydrates. But we like sugar. We like carbohydrates. So if we follow what we like, we lead ourselves into more and more suffering. And then we complain about it. The sugar, in the case of the diabetic person, represents all forms of sensuality, the pleasure of the senses, enjoyable things, pleasant things that come to us through the sixth sense door, and that all our lives has been our only source of joy and happiness in the life. For many people, an important one is sex or romantic relationships. Can be food, can be music, can be watching movies, can be going traveling, all kinds of different things. The desire that arises for any and all of these kinds of things is our true enemy when we want to end suffering. And yet, because it's all we've ever known, it's not easy to just uproot this desire completely one shot. So we have to take steps in order to be able to uproot it. Now, where the problem comes in is that we can cheat ourselves very nicely and sort of make an excuse for ourselves that, because I'm kind of weak and I am not able to uproot this attachment to sensual desires or sensual agreeable things completely right away. Therefore, I sort of say to myself, okay, then I can go in the environment full of sensuality, full of all the kinds of things that are a temptation for me, or all the kinds of things that are a problem for me, because I'm not able to uproot this attachment completely right away. But is this a reasonable way to think? Is this a logical way to think if it's our aim to uproot the attachment to sensuality? It's as if somebody who does not know how to swim and is afraid of drowning would decide to jump in the deep end of a swimming pool. Is it a good idea? I don't think so. If you don't have any armbands or supports and you don't know how to swim, then you just don't go in the swimming pool. What this refers to in the practice is, as long as our mindfulness is not steady enough or not strong enough, as long as we are not able to give up the desire of sensuality of whatever form, as long as we know that we still have weaknesses and that we are still liable to fall back in our practice and that it's not very strong, then we have to protect ourselves by keeping ourselves in an environment that's appropriate. So firstly, it means not associating with people who are immoral. We have to surround ourselves by practitioners, and if we really want to progress correctly, it is practically essential to have a good teacher who can correct and guide you every step of the way, especially if you're not very strong yet, and not putting ourselves deliberately into contact with things that will be problematic. There's a joke about an alcoholic who decides to give up alcohol as his New Year's resolution, and then 1 or 2 days after he has made the decision to give up alcohol, he says to himself, how do I know I've really given up alcohol when I don't see any alcohol around and I'm nowhere near the place where I used to go and drink? I will go and prove myself by walking along the street where there was the bar that I used to drink at. And so he walks along the street and he sees the bar, and then he says to himself, it's really very easy to walk along the street without being inside the bar and seeing all the alcohol. I will go and prove myself by going into the bar and looking at all the drink. So he goes into the bar, and then he stands in the bar and he says to himself, this is still too easy. I have to prove my willpower by ordering a drink and not drinking it. So he says to the barman, I will take a large pint of whatever was his favorite beer. So the barman serves him with his beer, and then he says, oh, look, I kept my resolution so well. Let's have a drink to celebrate. So what this joke represents is that we are very good at cheating ourselves in many different ways, but really, if you don't want to go to drink alcohol, or if you don't want to engage in any form of sensuality, don't go in the bar. If you don't know how to swim, don't jump in the deep end. In regard to this, we had two further examples. One example was from a teaching of the Buddha, in which he asks the person to whom he's teaching, so, what do you think? Suppose there is a green log full of sap, full of life, and it's lying in the water, submerged in the water. So if somebody comes along and tries to make fire with this green sappy log lying in the water, are they going to be able to succeed? No, of course not. And suppose there is a green sappy log that is lying on dry land far from the water, but it's still full of sap and green fresh. Will they be able to make water with this green fresh log full of sap? No, absolutely not. Because even if it's not in the water, still it's not dry. But suppose now this green log full of sap were to be taken and set in a dry place where there is no humidity for several months. So now that it is fully dry, now if somebody comes along and wants to take a fire stick and make a friction fire with this log, it is possible. So this represents three types of people. One is somebody who is fully in the world of sensuality, fully in society, and is also just not interested in giving up sensuality and is not on the path of the Buddhist teaching. The second log that is taken out of the water, but that is still wet, green, and full of sap. This represents somebody who is out of the environment of sensuality, is not actively engaging in acts of sensuality. For example, they will decide to practice celibacy, or they will decide to even enter a monastery, but inside the desire of sensuality has not been renounced. The desire of this kind of pleasure and this kind of happiness has not been given up. So it means that even if in their physical actions and in terms of in their environment they're not engaging actively in sensuality, in their mind they're still engaging with it, they're still enjoying it, they're still wishing for it. And so the point is that whether the fresh green log full of sap is out of the water or in the water, still it's impossible to make fire with it. So in the same way, somebody who is still attached and full of desire of sensuality, it's not possible for them to see Dhamma. Whether or not they live in a monastery or in a city or anywhere, they still cannot see Dhamma. And the only type of log that it's possible to make fire with is one that is both out of the water and has been fully dried out. So that means both in one's physical actions and in terms of the environment that you put yourself in, and in terms of the amount to which you are engaged with the desire of sensuality and attached to it mentally, you have to get out of those. But the very first thing that we have to absolutely do is to get the log out of the water, because if it's in the water, it's going to be literally impossible for it to ever dry out. So just like that, it's literally impossible to give up completely the attachment to sensuality while indulging in it and engaging with it and surrounding oneself with all objects of sensuality. Finally, then we had a third example, which is in regard to how we can, because of our attachment to a particular object or a particular state of mind, we don't solve it straight away, even though we could. We keep ourselves in a state of duality or in a state of keeping on falling back into the same desire or the same attachment or the same problem, and then we get out of it again. But why don't we just solve it once and for all? And if we transpose this into an example in material, Just a very simple example that everybody will recognize. If you're walking in the street and it's kind of a gravelly area, it might happen that a little tiny stone will get into your shoe. And here is where a lot of us have the tendency of laziness of, instead of just taking the time to stop, take off the shoe, remove the piece of gravel, and then continue on our way, we say, "Oh, no problem, no need," and we continue on walking. But with every single step, this piece of gravel is causing us a certain amount of pain or a certain amount of discomfort. And so now we have discomfort all the way along of our journey, instead of just being able to remove the shoe, get rid of the problem, and go along comfortably. So it's a little example of a minor problem, but at the same time, it represents very well the sort of lazy mind that doesn't want to take the trouble to go look, find the problem, solve it, and just remove it once and for all. We sort of prefer to live with the problem for a long, long time, even though we know that eventually we're going to have to remove it, solve it anyway. If that is, to come back to the point that we made in the beginning, it is really our aim to get rid of this problem and to end the suffering of it. So just to remind ourselves of the three main points that we mentioned today. First of all, everything starts with your aim. If your aim is clear, then all your actions should lead you towards your aim. Second, while we might not be able to achieve our aim all in one go, just like that, while we work towards our aim, we have to put ourselves in an appropriate environment to be able to work towards it efficiently and well. If we don't know how to swim yet, don't jump in the deep end of a swimming pool without support. The second example is that in order to reach the aim of finding wisdom and ending suffering, we have to give up the desires of sensuality that keep us in suffering. And this means giving up not only in physical actions, but in our thought as well. So just like the example with the fresh green piece of wood full of sap, whether it's in the water or out of the water, as long as it's still fresh, green and not dry, it's impossible to make fire with it. But it's also impossible to make it dry out if it's in the water. So the first thing is to get it out of the water, to remove ourselves from the physical actions of sensuality and the environment of sensuality. Thirdly, instead of allowing a problem, a sense of duality, a state of being continually fluctuating between working hard and then falling back, and then working hard and then falling back, it's better to just solve it once and for all. Otherwise, it becomes like the stone that we might carry in our shoe for a long, long time, causing us discomfort every step of the way until finally we come to the point where we've had enough and we remove it anyway.